My name is Dipmala, and I'm an assistant professor at a Department of Psychology, Christu Jayanti College. The topic of my today's video is Elaboration Likelihood Model of Persuasion, and these are the topics that I'm going to cover in today's video. So I'm going to talk about Elaboration Likelihood Model, two central approaches to persuasion that this model proposes. Further, I'm going to discuss why do we choose one particular approach over another. And finally, I'm going to end the video with a discussion on which approach is more effective and in what scenario. So let's begin. Elaboration likelihood model was proposed by Richard Petty and John Cacioppo in 1980s. This model is also known as dual process approach. So it's called as dual. I think we'll discuss on that. It can also be used as the mnemonics to really understand the concept. So there's a word dual. So there's something to do with the dual process or duality, the dual nature of this particular theory. So the core principle of this model is that in certain context, when we process persuasive messages, we tend to process the information. Sometimes we tend to process information deeply and attentively, where there's a lot of deliberation and careful thinking. And in certain occasion, we tend to process persuasive message rather effortlessly, okay, and unconsciously. So we're not aware of when we are processing persuasive message. So basically, this model banks upon or capitalizes on this concept in psychology. So there's this concept in psychology that we human beings, when we process information, there are two different ways that we process information from our surrounding. So we either process information in a controlled fashion. Okay, so when we are processing information in a controlled way, we are aware of what we are processing. There's an intent, there's a goal, there's an element of awareness, and we are in control of the process. And the other way in which we process information is called as automatic processing. So when we are automatically processing information, as the word denotes, this happens outside the realm of awareness. There's no control, there's no intent, there's no goal, and more or less you're not aware that you're processing a particular information. So these are two different ways in which we process information. Now, according to this model, when we are using a certain message or an argument to persuade somebody, there are two ways or route that we can follow. Okay, according to this model, there's one route that's called as the central route, and there's another route that we can follow when we are trying to persuade somebody, that's called as the peripheral route. So let's understand what they are. So according to the elaboration likelihood model, the central route is a route that we follow when an individual, it's an approach to persuasion when a person tends to be or is inclined to be thinking carefully and deliberately and are aware and attentive of the persuasive message that is being shared. If the person attends to the logic, the strength of the argument, and also in order to weigh the argument and the evidences that is being provided, if the person relies on relevant information of his or her own from past memory or experiences. So when you are inclined to think logically, when you are looking at the evidences, the strength of the argument, when you're thinking carefully and deliberately, what you're using is the central route to persuasion, okay, according to the elaboration likelihood model. Now there's another route. So here the person is engaging in controlled processing of information. Okay. Now another route according to the model is peripheral route. So according to this particular route or approach to persuasion, this is when the person actually processes information based on the superficial clue or easy to process information, like the attractiveness of the messenger or the person who is trying to persuade, the expertise of the person or the credibility of the person, the length of the message rather than the logic or the argument behind. You're just looking how much is the person really talking. If the person is talking more, apparently that would mean that the person knows more. Okay, so they're looking at superficial clue. They're not actually putting thought in that. And this is the peripheral route to persuasion. Okay. Now, what you need to take into consideration is that when you're talking about the credibility of a messenger, right? That, as I just discussed, it falls under the peripheral route. But you also need to take notice that when you are using the central route, there are times when you also take into consideration the credibility or the expertise of the person, right? Even when you are thinking in a controlled fashion and you're thinking logically, you're really thinking know about the pros and cons of the message that's being shared with you. You think about who's telling it, but the difference as to how you're thinking about the expertise or the credibility of the person when you're using the peripheral route or the central route is that here in the peripheral route, there's not much thought that's gone. You've just the idea that the person is expert or the person seems credible, no influences your attitude. Okay, so, wherein in the central route, you're actually putting in a lot of thought. You're seeing what's the credibility of the person. So that's the difference that you need to know. So, central route, there's a lot of thought, energy that goes into when you're trying to evaluate the persuasive message. Wherein the peripheral route, the processing is very effortless. The person's not putting much effort, and it's also at times mindless. So you're not aware of the information that you're processing. So according to the elaboration likelihood model, these are the two different approaches to persuasion. An individual tends to use either of these two approaches. So why do we use or choose one approach over another? So what actually determines that you at a particular point in time would choose central route or the peripheral route? Now, one factor or the determining factor would be the motivation. Okay, so what is the personal consequences that's attached to whatever message is being shared with you? So if it affects your goal, your aspiration, okay, your well-being, if there's a personal consequence, okay, that uh, the message is bearing for you, probably you would be using the central route to persuasion. Okay, so you'd be thinking logically, you'd be looking at the strength of the argument, you'd be deliberating on the message that's been shared, only following which will probably your attitude, no, your attitude would probably be changed towards or against the target object of persuasion. The second is the ability. So ability of the person or the recipient. So cognitive resources, if you are tired, if after a long day you are tired, you're not in a process, you don't have enough cognitive resources in terms of psychologically of there's fatigue, or probably biologically you don't have that ability or the cognitive ability to really process information, then in such scenarios, you also tend to use the peripheral route to persuasion. When you don't have enough time to really ponder upon the message that's being shared, you actually look at the superficial clue, whether the person's expert, whether the person's attractive, or is the person really giving a lot of, is the length of the message really long? So you look at this superficial cues in order to decide whether you're changing your attitude or not towards the target object. So these are the two determining factors which governs whether you use the central or the peripheral route to persuasion. Now, which one is more effective? Okay, so it's not that one is better. It depends completely upon the scenario that you are in and what is the nature of the message. So if the message is something that's very important, that bears personal consequences, probably you'll use the central route. So what you need to understand is when you're using the central route to persuasion, the change in the attitude, okay, towards the target object is lasting. Because what happens is when you're given certain argument, you tend to, when you're thinking about it, when you're weighing the pros and cons about it, what happens is there's this integration of the argument that takes place. You integrate the argument or whatever proposition that's been shared with you into your belief system. So there's this internal change that happens. So this change in attitude is not superficial. That's why it's long lasting. So there's this change in belief system that happens. Also, once you're persuaded and your attitude is changed, the particular change in attitude becomes further resistant to any persuasion. Okay, and this change in attitude also governs your future behavior. So it is more predictive when your attitude is changed through the central route, processing the information through central route. Then this change of attitude also governs or is more predictive of the behavior that you may conduct, the way you conduct yourself or behave yourself in the future. One thing that you need to take into consideration is that the central route requires effort and time. So probably when you are in hurry, that's the time you don't use the central route or approach to persuasion. Peripheral route is used when for immediate influences, when you know that the audience is not attentive, is not motivated enough, or lacks the ability. So probably that's when you actually package your message in a way that you're targeting the peripheral route or approach to persuasion when you're trying to persuade somebody. Okay, so it's not that one approach is more effective over another. It's when and where are you really using it. So when you have an understanding of this tool route or route to persuasion, you can actually cater your message or present your message in a way that either you're targeting the central route or the peripheral route or approach to persuading the target person, so that you are successful in your intent to persuade. So that's about today's video. So we have learned about likelihood model elaboration, model of elaboration likelihood model of persuasion. We have learned about in this, according to this model, there are two different approaches to persuasion or route to persuasion. We have central approach and we have peripheral approach. Central approach is when you are deliberately thinking and attending to information. You're thinking logically and you're gauging the strength of the argument. You are using the central approach. So what happens when you're using the central approach? The attitude change is more lasting. It's resistant to further change, and this change in attitude also predicts your future behavior, but it's effortful and it takes time. Now the other route to persuasion according to this model is peripheral route. This happens when the person doesn't have much time, is usually dependent on the superficial cues of the message, such as the length of the message or the expertise or credibility and attractiveness of the messenger. And the change in attitude through the peripheral route is not long lasting, but it is when you don't have much time and you have immediate influence, you need to make an immediate influence, wherein the target audience either lacks the ability or cognitive resources, doesn't have time, or is inattentive and lacks motivation because there's no personal consequences that's attached to the message that you're sharing. So that's when you target the peripheral route to persuasion. So thank you.